Hey everybody, Pure Insanity here, and this is a Diablo 4 PSA for all the folks running non-meta builds with quote-unquote pro builds, only to find themselves regularly getting thrashed in higher level nightmare dungeons. I've been frustrated as hell lately trying to figure out what in the F I'm missing taking these builds and gear suggestions and not being generally successful surviving higher level nightmare dungeons. And I finally figured it out. Most of them are a whole bunch of squishy garbage, but are super flashy, stacking offensive capabilities. These builds only really work in higher level nightmare dungeons when the nightmare dungeon is incredibly friendly to the build. If you're running 90 plus nightmare dungeons, two modifiers are going to be generally avoided, and I'll give you that. And that's going to be armor and resistance debuffs. But with these squishy builds, there are so many more modifiers that are practically instant death in so many scenarios. It depends on the build, but Death Pulse, Unstoppable, Volcanic, and Suppressors are all some modifiers giving big problems to these offensively stacked builds. And I'll present all my evidence and how I finally realized this. I've got some tier 100 gameplay in the background with my latest Quickshift Dolmen Stone build. On that note, I first want to give some acknowledgements before going full rant and explaining the story. I first want to give a shout out to my two favorite content creators, and that's Wadijo and Darth Microtransaction. And they're hardcore players, so they have to run legitimate, well-rounded builds. That might be why I like them so much, and that might be why I don't see this type of flashy offensive garbage in their recommendations. And I have to say, meta builds are meta. So right now, Ball Lightning Sorcerer, Combo Point Rogue builds, and of course, you've got your long-standing standards like Deathblow Barbarian, Pulverized Druid, etc. And those meta builds are absolutely well-rounded. You've also got boss killer builds. And that's a little bit of a different story because like they are a gimmick. And they're not really advertising themselves as anything but they're seldom used for higher level nightmare dungeons. They're stacked just to get that, one tap or two or three tap or just really super quick kill, but they're not really meant to be survivable and functional in like tier 100 nightmare dungeons. And a big part of the reason is you need 13.3k armor at tier 100 and only 9.3k at level 100. 9.3k armor is easy to get. If you get in a tier 100 dungeon running Godslayer, Tibalt's Will, and Flicker Step, you're gonna die, and a lot. There's no way you're gonna get the armor that you need to be generally survivable. Wadijo points this out with demonstration in a video he posted about 2 weeks ago from the time of this video, why you need armor and how it works. And he made that video in part because he kept on hearing comments from other people, why do I keep dying? And part of his thumbnail for the video is this is why you die. So if you don't trust me on this, or you have interest into the details on survivability in higher level nightmare dungeons, absolutely check that out. It's a great video. And that brings us to the first piece of evidence this rant is legit. Why would there be so many people asking for survivability tips when, if you buy into all the pro build shiny keys, if there's apparently boundless builds that just destroy everything? Update 1.2 really changed the game here because it did used to be true that as long as you had decent armor and ran the aspect of disobedience, you could stack your build a lot more offensively and still have survivability. That said, aspect of disobedience just isn't as good anymore after 1.2, which is why Wadijo doesn't recommend it anymore. I've had suspicions for a while about this because I almost never see these flashy, offensive videos showing the Nightmare Dungeon details. I'm a detail-oriented guy myself, so I like showing those details before I show Nightmare Dungeon clips. But when I'm presenting builds, I also want to make sure everyone knows I'm not just showcasing a super friendly Nightmare Dungeon. Admittedly, in this first Tier 100 Nightmare Dungeon, I find Flooded Runes to be one of the easier Nightmare Dungeons. That said, the first corridor, after dispelling the barrier, is a bitch for close combat, but otherwise, it is generally friendly. And that brings me to the bulk of the evidence and the bulk of my frustrations. I really like fast-paced, close combat builds, which generally suck for survivability in higher level Nightmare Dungeons. I also love build crafting and running non-meta builds. This last week, I've been working on my shifty Misfit Druid build, which combines a bit of Stormclaw and Bulwark build components with a Quickshift twist and some Druid broken toys. Everything was gold up until about Tier 85, but above that, there was always some sort of build issue depending on the Nightmare Dungeon details. Some Nightmare Dungeons I'd die because I wasn't killing mobs quick enough. I'd make adjustments, but then the next Nightmare Dungeon with different modifiers, I'd kill mobs quick enough, but didn't have enough survivability and would just poof, disappear from one-shots, dot pools, and things of the such. I first looked to a Stormclaw, quote-unquote, pro build variant with similarities and found he was using a lot of gear and build recommendations that led to instant death a large portion of the time. Not to mention, the armor on the build was only around 9,000, meaning so many things would just instantly delete you if disobedience isn't fully stacked. A prime example is using Bulwark with Tempest Roar builds, as these flashy offensive builds are typically using Tibalt's Will and Flicker Step as well. The only sources of armor are Chest and Amulet. Amulets can roll total armor and werewolf armor, but if your Paragon board isn't defensively spec'd, casting Bulwark and losing that 35% werewolf armor, even with disobedience, can drop your armor enough to get insta-deleted despite a fresh Bulwark barrier. And I can't tell you how frustrating it is to me to get insta-deleted because you cast Bulwark at an inopportune time, but it happened a lot. So I moved on to experimenting with my shifty Misfit Druid build and ran into the back and forth between survivability and killing mobs quick enough. With survivability focused, it mainly was elites causing problems, so I looked for some bigger changes to the build concept that could help. And that's when I uncovered some massive damage synergy using the Dolmen Stone in the build. But to get the build to have enough armor and resistance, I had to respec my Paragon board more for survivability. And to cover survivability in both werebear and werewolf forms, you must have total armor on werebear armor on pants and werewolf armor on boots. Consequently, most werewolf builds using Tibalt's Will and Flicker Step are flashy offensive garbage. I had a lot of fun and success with the Dolmen Stone respec, but I wanted to look to see if I could find any Dolmen Stone build recommendations that might make it even better. The Dolmen Stone builds I've seen were mostly level 100 boss killer builds, but I hadn't seen a Nightmare Dungeon tier 100 build using the Dolmen Stone. I found a Dolmen Stone build with Nightmare Dungeon tier 100 gameplay, but guess what? Tibalt's Will, Flicker Step, and an offensively spec'd Paragon board. Bullshit! Just bullshit. It does not work in the general context. And perhaps this is more of a Druid build issue, but you see Tibalt's Will and Flicker Step in so many build recommendations nowadays. Granted, Tempest Roar is very common in Druid builds, but you also see a lot of recommendations to use Godslayer in other classes too. No wonder why would Daijo was getting so many questions about why people are dying so much in high level nightmare dungeons. So many people are using these crap, flashy garbage builds that content creators are selling as awesome. End of rant. So to conclude my PSA, if you're trying out a new build that you just found and it is heavily offensively spec'd, particularly the builds that have little armor using Godslayer, Tibalt's Will, and Flicker Step, just be weary of the build. If you keep dying using the build recommendations, you aren't doing anything wrong. They're just not meant to be survivable. They're just flashy, offensive builds that, don't get me wrong, they could be a lot of fun, but they're not built for survivability. So just know that and don't get super frustrated if you're dying using those builds. On that note, I hope you enjoyed the video and the PSA. Until next time.